There is nothing the United States has done since the Vietnam War ended that is anything remotely close to Ukraine. I often describe where my field of battle in Ukraine, which was in Kharkiv province during the counteroffensive and the months leading up to it, was closer to the Ardennes forest of Belgium and France in 1944. Only in winter, when we had fog and no air power. So it was men with rifles, tanks, and artillery. And that's all the resources you get, right? And drones are the equivalent of those little Piper Cub observation aircraft that could fly just, a few hundred feet in the air and look for them. So we stepped back in history, but we're fighting the war that we really prepared for in the 1970s and 80s. And here's a little clue that's going to be very interesting. We are now beating, when I say we, this is the Ukrainians. I was a Legionnaire. I am still a Legionnaire. My battalion commander wants me to come back right now, today. We are fighting the Russians, who have their most advanced equipment, whatever they think is their best, with equipment and technology from the 1970s. And that's the war we would have fought had we had a fight with the Soviet Union. It would have been a massacre, just as it's a massacre right now. It's just we could use bigger and better weapons. Let me tell you how and why the Russians adapted, because the news media really got this wrong, certainly last summer with the counteroffensive. They say, oh, the Russians spent this spring and the few months before the counteroffensive preparing defenses. That's not what happened. The first wave of the Russian war, Russia got utterly beat almost everywhere along the line, particularly in the north. Just destroyed. 3 armies eliminated until they withdrew. So these are the guys who got surprised. Most of their professional soldiers died. Then came what we call the head-on-anvil strategies that the Ukrainians allowed the Russians to do. By June, you were seeing operations in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The Russians would send a mass of soldiers into a Ukrainian anvil. And the Ukrainians would prepare heavy defenses and allow them to hammer their head against these cities until they lost 10, 20,000 soldiers at a time. And then, as President Zelensky says, when you've completed that defense and we've lost 10,000 soldiers, we'll give you that village of 5,000 people and move back 2 kilometers. And then you'll do it against Lysychansk. And then you'll lose 5,000 soldiers. And we'll give you that little dirt village or that small town. And as President Zelensky said, oh, we're going to get it back. Your soldiers are dead. This is what we call the head against anvil strategy. Russia would just bash its brains out. That happened in June, July. But by August, Ukraine had been preparing its own counteroffensive. And the Russians had pretty much dug in along the line and were still in the same posture that they were in March, April, and May, right? Still thinking they could do these offensives. The Ukrainians had no combat capacity. And that's when the September counteroffensive occurred in Kharkiv province. And that was, to me, that was amazing because, and it will be the last time it ever happens. Ukraine caught the Russians off guard due to good reconnaissance, due to good strategic intelligence sharing with the United States. And what I thought was a very tough line shattered in a matter of hours. And in fact, I made a video as a joke because we were the Special Purpose Brigade. We were very far out with the Joint Special Operations Task Force at the tip. But within 3 hours, the Russian line had fallen so fast, artillery was coming up behind me. I was like, they're supposed to be 20 kilometers behind me. The Russians ran everywhere. Where we were, Ivanivka, Izium, and the western approaches to Kupiansk. When they told us we were going to take Kupiansk in 72 hours, I was like, this is going to be a tough fight. We're all going to be shooting all day, all night. But the Russians shattered like broken glass because they didn't think Ukraine had the offensive capability. But some things, the Russians, they fell back almost all the way to the Russian border in many of those areas. Now, come November 2022, this is where Russia really put the posture that they're in right now. They spent all winter digging in tank traps, millions of landmines, and those lines were very tough. When I met Minister Reznikov earlier in spring of 2023, first time he ever met a Legionnaire. That's a little surprising, right? Hundreds and hundreds of us, he met me in a diplomatic briefing. I was with some VIPs, and he said, this counteroffensive will not be what you had happened in 2022. It won't be easy. It's going to be tough. We're going to push all along the Russian line and see what breaks, right? So the Russians changed their strategy to do defense in depth, and that worked. It worked for them, okay? But what else also worked was Mobniks, bringing out hundreds of thousands of disposable men. And then they started the same head against anvil strategy on Bakhmut. Right? Head against anvil. Let's just lose thousands and thousands of guys. But it became so clear Russia had adopted this, and they didn't care what the people were. They had fantasies in their head that if they take Bakhmut, they could break through the Kramatorsk, and they would be in Dnipro in hours. And everybody was like, are they crazy? No, they would just rather lose 10, 20,000 men. Same thing occurred this fall in Avdiivka. Okay, Avdiivka should have fallen in 2014. I was there. It was heavily fortified, but it really was 10 years past its due date. And for the Russians to now do head against anvil again in Avdiivka for one small town, they're just slaughtering their own forces and their own armor. So say what you will. Yes, Ukraine is suffering. All of our forces are fighting. Men are being rotated through these combat zones and are taking losses. But Russia thinks they can sustain these deaths. And they can't if America gives Ukraine the resources we need at the levels we are asking for. Here's the level, unlimited. Okay, if they were to have given us not 100 ATACMS missiles or 10 ATACMS missiles or whatever it was, 100, but the US is about to destroy 1,000 ATACMS missiles. We'd have to pay like $1 billion to get rid of them. Just say, hey, all the inventory goes to Ukraine. Bye. Right? We're building brand new missiles that are even better than the ATACMS missile. But we saw on day one, rocket one, Ukraine destroy an entire Russian helicopter base, right, with these missiles. For the coming year, I think that the Ukrainians might be more open with General Syrskyi to sitting down with NATO and actually developing a Ukrainian-based offensive strategy. When we hit Kupiansk, we had every tank in northern Ukraine assigned to us. One night I was there, I thought it was like D-Day. Just tanks started coming in at 4 in the afternoon, and 7 the next morning. They were still rolling nonstop all night. And we hit the Russians so hard with massed power. We also need to understand, and we comprehended last year, that engineering, sappers, right, going through, being able to breach assault lines, knowing the Russians just have to sit there and shoot at you, okay? General Zaluzhny had a strategy last year that started in June about counter-battery fire, neutralizing every Russian artillery battery. If we had 5,000 more HIMARS missiles and 200 more launchers, we could own Russian artillery. The United States has that many launchers waiting to be repaired, or the National Guard, if I'm not mistaken, has like 350 launchers. They're used on weekends only. Weekends only, and they don't even shoot, right? They just sit there and get painted and cleaned and all that stuff. I think a strategic effort, the incrementalism of Washington needs to end. I have said that to people on the National Security Council, looked them right in the eye. And I was like, you need to stop this. Well, we're going to give you this one thing, and maybe that will help you. Why the United States why President Biden hasn't embraced what I would call a 100 F-16 initiative. I'd make that big, he should have made that announcement last night at the State of the Union. All stops are out for America. The abject, total, absolute, utter defeat of Russia is now America's strategic priority. We're going to give you the hammer, Ukraine, start hammering. But he has people on his National Security Council staff who worry more about Russia. There's only one thing Russia hasn't done, and that's used a nuclear weapon. It's the only weapon they have not used in their arsenal. And the way they're getting beat, they're not going to. Because one, the radiation just goes back into Russia. We saw that at Chernobyl. But we have to stop thinking we can manage through sniper shots of little pieces of equipment like 24 F-16s here and 12, HIMARS in this batch. Empty. The old reserve. Did you know we were giving Morocco 500 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles? The Bradley, if your viewers don't know, it's a murder machine. Okay? The Ukrainians, if you saw that one video of the Bradley going against the T-90, the most absolute brand new vehicle in its inventory, and the Bradley runs out and hoses it down and ducks back, and the Russian tank starts burning, and he comes out and he just hammers it and hammers it and hammers it. That was one Bradley. It's a murder machine. And why the United States didn't go to Morocco, who does not need it, doesn't need it. I've been to Morocco. I've seen their army. And just say, hey, we're going to cancel that order. We'll get you something in the future, and say, all of these Bradleys onto ships right to Ukraine right now. Go through every armored Humvee that is going to be turned over to another army needed to have gone to Ukraine, right? They didn't even use Lend-Lease. But that's because there are individuals who are more afraid of Donald Trump talking bad about them than saving Ukraine. So go figure. Ukraine is without all question the single most experienced army in the world. And here's why. Because when this war's over, the threat is not over to Ukraine. Everyone's going to be a reservist this war. Okay, Zelensky says he has 500,000 men in uniform. Virtually everyone has stayed there for 2 years, men and women. These old hands, right, these graybeards like me, they're going to be training these young kids who are 18. And one thing I have to say about General Syrskyi, a lot of people don't like him. He rotated literally every brigade into major combat in like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, to get that experience of, if they didn't have it before. We sat in Kharkiv, we were like, yay, we broke glass and went up and took Kupiansk. That's nothing. That's not Bakhmut, baby. Okay, that was not Avdiivka or Avdiivka or any Lysychansk. That was none of the hard places. Everyone got rotated to the hard spot so that they would know what real fighting was like. And we lost a bunch of really great guys in my platoon. But everyone in Ukraine has some measure of combat experience. And if you've never been bombarded for 72 hours nonstop, okay, then you haven't been in a war. It's just that simple. You've been in a police action, a counterterrorism action, a counterinsurgency. This is full-scale, wholesale, war fighting. And Ukraine is now the global dominant. Russia, by the way, they won't survive this war. Whoever gets out of this war will never look at Ukraine twice.
Before 2022, unfortunately, there were no clear perspective of bringing Crimea back to Ukraine. People were under occupation, under oppression, under the threat of their lives, and they didn't see the possibility for the next 10 years, for example, for Crimea to come back. The full-scale invasion completely changed the situation. I mean, that first of all, everyone saw that Ukraine not only is able to resist, to make a resilience, but also is able to release the territories, that the army is strong, that there are all the limitations on non-military means usage or something like that, because we do remember that it's always were a discussion about only diplomatic means toward Crimea, and all our partners were insisting on such a wording in all the official documents. So all these limitations gone. I mean, that everyone understands that this is war, this is military means, military operations, that Russia has no intention to live by their goodwill. They can leave the Crimea and other occupied territory only in result of military operations. And people saw that these operations are possible and they are feasible, that the releasing of Crimea is some kind of feasible perspective. All the military experts whom I'm talking to, they're saying that the liberation of Crimea from the military point of view is much easier task than liberation of the so-called mainland territories like Donbass and Lugansk regions. Because the Crimea is a peninsula and geographically, and it's like a quite an isolated area, and we see that within this war, Ukrainian army was using this tactic when we cut off logistic routes, when we cut off supplies, and afterwards the army of Russia became much weaker, and actually the offensive became much easier. With Crimea, these tactics can work even better, because we have quite a limited supply chains. So as soon as we approach the peninsula itself, this is like a small bridge to peninsula, and cut off the carriage bridge, cut off the land supplies, the liberation of Crimea would be just a matter of a time of few months is when the army to be exhausted. And what we see from now, that we see that Ukraine already is substantially limited capabilities of supplies, of connection of Russia through the sea. So with this quite an active operation of Ukraine on the sea domain, Russia is not so active and not so flexible. So I would say that this looks like a shaping operation already. But of course, we're highly dependent from the supplies of the long-range missiles, for example, to disconnect the carriage bridge. But technically, this operation is highly possible, and I think that we will see some kind of increasing of this shaping activities quite soon. If you cut the supplies, you give just a few months, and most of the army won't have enough food, ammunition, and all the other part of it we consider will be evacuated by itself from Crimea, yes, using the different opportunities. So I don't think that we will even facing some kind of a heavy land operations. However, the military experts would know this better. But as we discussed before with you also, historically Crimea was always occupied or deoccupied by the military power, yes, by military operations. It never was passing from one side to another in some kind of diplomatic ways. Yes, it was always a military pressure, which looks already started with this a disconnection. As I said, Russia relocated most of the ships from Crimea to Novorossiysk ports facilities. And so they trying to hide as much as possible capabilities from Crimea, relocate to some other parts, because Ukraine is already reaching Crimea, reaching quite actively. Again, we are limited with missiles capabilities, but we actively using drones. And the more Ukraine developed the long-range drones, the worst situation with Russia presence in Crimea is, because before they were like quite inactively using these sea platforms, for example, for shelling Ukraine, or airports for locating their fighter jets, which is not so already now. So we like a observe now substantial decrease of the land sea launches of the missiles on the from the Russian ships to Ukraine, and we observe that many airports were evacuated. So we see how Russia already squeezing its capabilities from Crimea because they feel unsafe. Well, the problem is that the bridge is like a construction which needs to be destroyed with some like a massive explosives, and no one of drones can just like bear such an explosives, and no any drones for now can just like hit those points which are crucial for like a strength of the construction. And that is why we're speaking about necessity to guard the possible types of the long-range missiles. If we speak about Germany, this is Taurus, and this is one of the principal capabilities we need to destroy it effectively. There could be not only Taurus, but some like other missiles with some proper characteristics. But I would say that Taurus is the most reachable for us. Yes, for now. Unfortunately, as we see, still we have some kind of excuses from Germany, from Scholz, whatever. Whatever happens, we have a different type of excuses, and all these excuses are actually not very trusted, because we saw that some of them like using arguments which are not applicable to the situation, and we also all of us heard this discussion of the German military personnel, which was like discussing that it's only about 10-15 missiles what needed to broke up the bridge actually. So I hope that, with all the efforts, with collective efforts, we will reach the purpose, and we will just somehow to ensure, Mr. Scholz, that we need them for not only for Ukraine, yes, but for establishing the security situation in the Black Sea, decreasing substantially the capabilities of Russia, which is required now, and which is all the European leaders are speaking about now. And I would like also to explain that the longer we, don't make some critical moves, the longer the war will continue, and the more expenses will be borne by Ukraine, of course, but also by European countries, because finally I think that most of the leaders declared that they do understand that this is the war not only of Ukraine, but this is the war which directly threatens, physically threatens to the most of European countries, including Germany. Ukraine's maritime strategy in this war, it's actually something which was declared as a necessary strategy for the future and for the current war, unfortunately. It means that we need to use the very asymmetrical approach, very innovative, because we can never compare Ukrainian potential capabilities with Russian. I mean that we always will have less people, less weapons, less munition, just because of the size, just because of the level of preparation. So we cannot just overcome them with standard capabilities it was used in the Second World War or in other wars. So we need to invent something more innovative. We need to invent something more flexible and very asymmetric. The sea drones, it's like a very, very good example of how it can happen. Yes, you're absolutely right that it's already around 30% of the actual numbers. But this means not only 30% of decreasing of capability, it means much more in capabilities, because this is like you cannot just apply this number of capabilities. The capabilities actually, I would say, decreased like more than half, because first of all, they lost one of the biggest situational awareness ship. I'm telling about the Moskva, yes, which was used for covering the situational awareness purposes and covering the protection, like defense purposes. They lost a lot of maneuver ships, like small maneuver ships. They lost a lot of those which were used for transportation, and they actually almost lost the capabilities of deploying the troops, amphibious operations, because many ships of these vessels of this type were eliminated. So we're speaking about much more serious capabilities loss than only 30%. And as I said, also they relocated some ships from Crimea to Novorossiysk, but Novorossiysk port is not applicable for keeping up such a high a readiness fleet, and that makes them a trouble. That's why Russians try now to use the Georgian waters and Georgian ports for placement of some kind of their fleet, but still it just decreases their ability to react. It just decreases their ability to make the strikes and operations on the Black Sea. And you see that we use it now for making our own grain corridor, which we don't need to, coordinate with someone, which we are not dependent on someone's decision on negotiations. And the corridor is working quite well. We just increased transportation of goods from Ukraine to the level already before the invasion. And I think that's a great achievement, and that's great, a proof that these asymmetric methods are working. We need more and more these big military drones, which are more precise, which are long range, which can bear a lot of destruction power on board. And so we see here private initiatives. We see here a public-private partnership when the government cooperates with the private companies. We see efforts of our partners who also promise to supply some drones, or UAV, quite a big one. So this is some kind of massive operation now. We obviously don't have overcapacity, so we still need a lot of them. We still need a lot of them also because we need to compensate lack of ammunition, lack of long-range missiles, lack of other capabilities which Ukraine doesn't obtain. But even should we have an ideal situation with the ammunition, with the artillery, with long-range missiles, still drones would be heavily used in this war because they are still cheaper. They are less obvious for observations. They are a more flexible weapon, which give us a weapon or a tool which give us some kind of possibility to use it massively, and therefore spread attention of our enemy. And what else we should say, that speaking about drones, we should understand that the cycle of this operation, yes, is quite fast. So we have, if you try something new, you have 2-3 months as maximum before Russian will understand how to deal with it and will try to copy the technology. And so even having established production, you need constantly develop and redevelop your equipment, your drones, whatever you use there, to protect it better from electronic warfare, to protect it better from the vision, the vision technologies. So it's a constant development which is required. And I believe that within this war, drones and UAVs demonstrated that actually we have a combination of very classical approach with very innovative approach, and it will continue. We see that how Iran, for example, actively developed these technologies just because they're cheaper, just because they can be used. And I think that many other countries are now looking at this war. They started to develop these technologies, and we will face with more and more drones operation in small wars, in some kind of local wars. So that's something which we're already in.